tonight. Can everyone in the back hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right, so I've been tasked with analyzing the current situation in Europe as it's very quickly developing, as you could gather from what Liz had to say. Of course, everything has changed in the last week with this horrific terror attack in Paris that took 130 lives. Of course, we have to recognize the fact that just a day earlier, there was also a horrific massacre by the same organization, the reactionary fascistic Islamic State, in Beirut, which did not really garner the same type of media coverage. And I think that a lot of us were able to see that in terms of even the way it played out on social media, with Facebook activating its security check for those who were in Paris. People in Beirut were wondering why they weren't given the same kind of treatment. They said we're also human beings who happen to largely use social media, including Facebook. There was, of course, the rush to change profile pictures and filters to the French flag. So it brought up all of these contradictions about whose lives actually matter when it comes to the Western narrative about the victims of this reactionary violence. And as the Syrian ambassador to the United Nations, Bashar al-Jafari, put it just a day after the Paris attacks, and by the way, the Syrian government said that we completely understand what the French people are going through because, in fact, we've been dealing with this every day for the past 5 years almost. In reality, France's 1311 is really Syria's 24/7. It's something that they've been going through and have been facing, and in a sense, almost fighting alone, and actually fighting some of these same Western powers who have been inadvertently or directly funding some of these terrorist organizations. And Bashar al-Jafari, he said that, when they target French people, they call them terrorists. But then when they were just targeting us in Syria, they called them merely jihadists, right? So even this terminology is skewed when we look at that issue. And, with events in Paris, you really have to think who stands to benefit in the political arena from this. I mean, the initial subject of my talk here tonight was the political shift to the left in Europe, because we have seen some very exciting developments where you have parties such as Syriza in Greece that comes out of the international communist movement and is broadly on the left of the political spectrum, a radical party, actually taking the reins of power in Greece. Or in Portugal, where now you have a triple left alliance that the Communist Party is a part of, along with the left bloc and the more centrist Portuguese Socialist Party. And you have developments in Spain with Podemos, a party that's very much structured and organized around the Syriza model, actually coming to a position of being the second largest party in the country. Or in England, where Jeremy Corbyn, this radical anti-imperialist who's been in parliament for 30 years but was always on the back bench, is now suddenly the leader of the same party that Tony Blair led. That's a huge transformation. But in Europe, you also have a situation where there's strong polarization because of the economic crisis and because of now the refugee crisis or the migrant crisis. So it's not just a shift to the left, there's very much a danger of far-right politics, fascist politics, or outright Nazi politics. And in France, an example of that is the National Front Party, which is led by Marine Le Pen. And in the European elections last year, actually they were the big victors. Not that they scored more seats than others that, they sent to the European Parliament in Brussels, but the fact that opinion polls now suggest that, in fact, the National Front could win the election in France next year is a very scary prospect. And that's not exactly unlinked to the situation that we have in the United States, where somebody like Donald Trump, who certainly espouses very fascistic views in terms of wanting to build a border wall that he would model after the one in Palestine, the Israeli apartheid wall that targets the Palestinian people, or, when he's going out and he's calling for, the Syrian refugees to not be let in, or all Muslims to have to enter a database, and then is challenged on that, and people wonder, how does this really differ from something that Hitler would have proposed during the time of Nazi Germany, right? So you see this political polarization where lots of forces are responding to what looks like the inability in Europe and also here of the centrist parties, whether center-left, such as the Democratic Party here, or the center-right, such as the Republican Party. They're probably a little more generally to the far right now, or certainly moving more so in that direction. But you have a situation where the playing field has sort of widened as a result of people looking for solutions to austerity, to their economic woes, to really the fundamental contradictions within the capitalist system that don't seem to be able to solve themselves. And in Europe, there's other parties as well. You have in Britain the British National Party or the English Defence League. In Greece, actually, despite this huge, shift to the left with Syriza in power, you have Golden Dawn, which is an explicitly neo-Nazi organization that's actually the third largest party in parliament and won slightly more votes in the most recent snap election than they had before. You have Jobbik in Hungary, and then you have more, less explicitly racist or bigoted parties that also belong on the far right of the spectrum, but try to sort of masquerade some of their more regressive and hateful politics. And sometimes this is very easy to see through. For example, in Britain, there's UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, which I went, for example, to one of their final campaign rallies, and the whole premise of it was that they wanted to show that they weren't racist, so they had one candidate from each, ethnic background in London come to the podium to espouse the fact that UKIP wasn't a racist organization. But in fact, they very much are. And, but they appeal to some of the same sort of narratives and senses of injustice that exist within society that, for example, many of us on the left would, right? They look at austerity. Some of the more far-right parties or the neo-Nazi parties will even use terms like capitalism, or they'll talk about a fight against globalism, right? But they're doing so from a very narrow nationalistic point of view, and they're appealing, for example, to national workers or, the exploited white man in society. And they play upon this anti-immigrant and anti-refugee rhetoric, which is so important at the moment because there's the largest refugee crisis that we've seen since World War II at the moment. And in fact, according to the United Nations, there's more displaced people on the face of the planet now than there have been at any time in recorded history. It's actually higher than it was after the Second World War. You have about 60 million displaced people who have been dragged from their homes, mostly from countries in what's called the Middle East. And if you look at those countries, they're mostly countries that have been targets of imperialist regime change operations. Whether we're talking about Libya, which now has no central government, it has two parliaments, one of them which is on a ship, and another one which is actually in Tripoli, but they're fighting against each other for control of the country. Hillary Clinton gave a speech the other day where she was trying to defend her role in the Libyan, and you remember after Gaddafi had passed away, had actually been brutally executed by US-backed and Western-backed rebels, she said very casually to a camera, "We came, we saw, he died," expressing no kind of remorse whatsoever. But you look at countries like that, or you look at Afghanistan, where many people are fleeing. It's estimated now that 40% of people in Afghanistan, if they could leave the country, they would leave the country. And you have many of them who are at basically stops all throughout Europe. Many who are trying to get to the UK, so they may be in a place like Calais in France and experience horrible racism, or many who are coming from Syria or Iraq, and they're stuck at these border fences that some of these reactionary and very backwards governments in Europe are trying to build, such as along the Hungarian border. So you have this horrible refugee situation, and you also have many Europeans who are very welcoming to the refugees. That has to be said. In Germany, for example, which now will see 900,000 refugees in just the last 3 months of the year. When I was in Germany 3 months ago, the estimate was that that was the amount that were going to come for the entirety of 2015. But the reality is that now they're saying that's the number for just the last 3 months. The total number that will try to reach Germany, or that may reach Germany this year, actually exceeds 1.5 million. And you have about 500,000 Syrian refugees sort of within the borders of the European Union or trying to get into the European Union. And then you have this completely reactionary legislation that the Republican-dominated House of Representatives passed yesterday, which President Obama says that he's going to veto. We'll see if that actually happens. But even Obama's plan for taking in Syrian refugees was so inadequate. I mean, to take 1,500, that's the amount of Syrian refugees that have been taken by the United States since 2011. In almost 5 years now of this regime change operation that the U.S. bears a huge responsibility for, because they funded very, very overtly, actually, some of these rebel groups because they wanted to overthrow the Ba'athist government in Syria that they refer to as the Cuba of the Middle East. This is the type of terminology that neoconservative commentators have been using to discuss Syria since at least the mid-1980s. Right? So 1,500 refugees so far. Obama's plan is for 10,000 next year. Okay, so that's quite an increase if you compare it to those very pitiful numbers, but it's actually painfully inadequate. And a country like the US, of course, could very easily absorb those refugees. In fact, the number of refugees coming to Europe, they could very easily also absorb those numbers of refugees, right? So you have this burning issue, which is really creating a lot of tension between different political parties and ideologies in Europe. In Germany, you have an organization called Pegida, which is holding these very large anti-immigrant and anti-refugee rallies across what's actually mostly the eastern part of Germany. Now, if you remember, eastern part of Germany used to be a separate country. It used to be the German Democratic Republic. It was a socialist country until 1990. And then what we've seen is that actually a lot of people who were even opposed to that particular government at the time have said, you know what, it actually wasn't that bad because we had free education, we had free healthcare, we had our basic rights and needs provided for, everybody had a job, everyone had a useful place in society. Perhaps there were some problems in terms of bureaucracy or how democratic society was or any of these things, but maybe they were actually secondary, right? So you have a situation where a lot of people have lost their jobs, their pensions are crumbs compared to what they had before, and you have this lack of ideology. You have this hole, so to speak, and that's being filled a lot of times by this appeal to reactionary anti-immigrant or neo-Nazi ideology sort of coming in and taking the place of socialism or Marxism, which previously had explained the contradictions and the problems in society. But to speak about some of the positive developments, we do have what we saw earlier this year. In January in Greece, the victory of the Syriza party was definitely an earth-shattering event, something that was really unprecedented. I mean, a few years ago, it looked as if they were going to win political power in the election, and they came very close to doing so. But what was it that brought about this Syriza victory? And first of all, what is Syriza? I mean, they call themselves the coalition of the radical left. It was actually founded in the late 1980s, not as a unitary political party, but as a coalition simply to contest elections. And it was an initiative in the beginning of the Communist Party of Greece to partner with certain other radical groups to perhaps do better at the ballot box. And the original name of the organization was Synapsismos, and then that later became Syriza, which means, as I've stated, the coalition of the radical left. So with Greece having been under very intense austerity that was imposed by the Troika, so, the Troika is essentially the financial institutions of the European Central Bank, the European Commission, and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. You had Greece, this very poor country within the European Union that was having to take all of these loans to stay afloat. And then the stipulations from the Troika were that you have to slash public services in order to pay us back. So I was just in Athens about 2 months ago, and I can tell you even now, because of really the inability of Syriza to be able to counter that dominant Troika and German capital in particular, they've been able to make some headway perhaps in addressing certain social problems, but you still have a situation where the National Library in Athens is closed most of the time, and the steps of it are riddled with heroin needles. Yeah, you can walk around in the downtown. It's not an exaggeration to say that there's people who are just completely alienated from society, and drug addiction is a massive, massive part of the scene in Athens, right? Because there's no work. There's no work, there's no hope. Perhaps there's hope in the political arena though, right? Because people did vote again for Syriza. Yeah. But in terms of the day-to-day encountering the dominance of the capitalist institutions, that's a key question, right? Because Syriza thought that they could do it within the framework of the European Union. They're part of a tendency, the party of the European left, which thinks that it's possible to transform the European Union as a block of capital from within it, right? And the fact that Alexis Tsipras and the Syriza leadership thought that they could go to negotiations and actually see this through, I think it took them, by surprise when they realized that in fact the Germans weren't going to budge, and some of the Troika members weren't going to budge either. And yet divisions within the capitalist world where, for example, Barack Obama even was saying we should be a little more sympathetic with the Greeks. And then Angela Merkel and the Germans were taking a very hard line. So you ended up with this situation which was, I think, to a lot of people on the left, and I can imagine in Greece, a little bit disorienting, where, there was the vote that Tsipras put to the Greek people, which I think said a lot, which I think sort of boosted his stature in the stature of Syriza in a lot of ways. They said, this is what we've been offered by our European creditors. Should we say yes to it, or should we say no to it? They had that vote on July 3rd. 61% of the Greek people said no, or oshi. And within days, the Greek government, which had just received this mandate to actually say no to this harsh and brutal austerity, was back at the negotiating table and actually ended up accepting a deal that was much worse in some respects than the two previous bailouts that had been passed by the mainstream bourgeois parties, New Democracy and the Social Democratic PASOK party. So I think there was some demoralization there, but at the same time, Tsipras, for all of his honesty, remained a very popular figure. He actually was the most popular prime minister in Greek history, according to opinion polls. So when he resigned, and then there was a split in the Syriza party, some of the more hardline elements, some of those who thought that he could have done better, or the Greek government negotiating team could have done better, they broke away to form Popular Unity. And, the Communist Party, for their part, sort of just sat it out. They sat it on the side and they said that we shouldn't form any type of leftist coalition government with Syriza because they're actually not sufficiently socialist or revolutionary. That was essentially their political line. Pointing to the fact that they just wanted to sort of mitigate some of the worst effects of capitalism and not call for the overthrow of it, at least not yet. So the Greek situation, again, like now Tsipras and Syriza are back in power. They're in a very contradictory situation where they are actually overseeing a bailout that they implemented really out of pressure from the European Union, pressure from this institution, and pressure from German capital. And the bourgeois parties are clearly not to be trusted. I think this is one of the biggest lessons from this all. The Greek people have lost faith largely in some of the parties that they would vote for in huge numbers before. PASOK, which used to be the second largest party in the country, has gone down to single digits. I think they placed 5th or 6th in the last election. They've lost pretty much a huge part of their legitimacy. So despite, the contradictions of now Syriza is calling for workers to strike against their own government. In other words, we have to implement certain things because we're within the framework of this agreement, but we still encourage you to strike against us. Right? So you have this struggle going on within Parliament, extra-parliamentary struggle, and there's a lot happening in general in the Greek scene. I know I'm pressed for time, so I want to move on to Britain, which saw something that very much surprised me just a few months ago. I was actually living in London until about a month ago, so I witnessed some of this. I don't know how many people have followed the rise of Jeremy Corbyn or the different trends within the Labour Party, but as I alluded to, the Labour Party was the same party that Tony Blair was a part of when he was teaming with George W. Bush for the invasion of Iraq. So it's not a party that, from my generation, a lot of people would look at and say they're a progressive force, or certainly not a revolutionary force. But Labour has a very distinctly different history than, let's say, the Democratic Party in this country. It comes out of the Socialist movement. It comes out of the Marxist movement. In 1945, it had its first majority government after the Second World War, and in large part because of the influence of the Communist Party in Britain, and in large fact because you had a socialist bloc which was now constructed to the east that was providing their workers with, again, the right to all of the necessities of life. Suddenly healthcare was a human right. Suddenly a job was a human right, a pension was a human right, childcare was a human right, a home was a human right. All of these things had happened. So I think a lot of the capitalist governments in Western Europe looked at this and they said, we have to certainly give our workers something so there's less of a chance of a rebellion against us and the overthrow of the capitalist class. But, Labour, despite being a party of imperialism that oversaw in many ways a lot of the atrocities of the British Empire at that time, they were still able to construct the National Health Service, for example. So in Britain now, and I was keen to get certain things done, for example, at the dentist before I left England, because I said, I don't know what it's going to be like when I go back to the United States. But the National Health Service still exists. That's a universal healthcare system, right? And you have socialist groupings that have been affiliated to the Labour Party, who have tried to work within the Labour Party, who think that that's the best vehicle for social transformation, at least in the short term. Whether that's actually, the case or not, I can't actually judge from my perspective. I was in touch with a lot of different forces within the British left. But nonetheless, the victory of Corbyn was huge because this is somebody who's the chairman of the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign. He's the honorary chair of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign in London, an anti-imperialist who actually spoke here in Washington, D.C. in 2003 at the huge rally against the Iraq War. Somebody who I knew from just being at every single rally, just a humble guy. I said, oh yeah, that's that old guy from the Labour Party. Like, he's always around and he's always so humble and you would never think he's a politician. So the idea was to run an anti-austerity candidate for the Labour Party leadership. And he just sort of threw his hat in the ring and he said, yeah, I'm going to do it. So, there was a huge mobilization against austerity in the streets of London in June. That's the first time I saw the flyers. It said Jeremy Corbyn for leader. And I was thinking, well, that sounds really fantastic. Obviously, there's no way that he's going to win, but it's good that he's at least utilizing this election to try to throw, this anti-capitalist, anti-austerity message into the ring with all of the other contenders. There's actually betting agencies or booking agents in Britain that had odds on the entire campaign, right? This is a big thing in Britain. Like, you go and you bet on everything. It's like, I bet on the football match tonight or the rugby, and oh yeah, like, who's going to be the Labour Party leader? Jeremy Corbyn, some of them had him at 100 to 1, others 200 to 1. And then within weeks, when they were hitting the campaign trail, you saw something which I think is similar in a sense to some dynamics here in the United States, where Bernie Sanders, despite his limitations and despite the fact that what he calls democratic socialism is, different than the way we would define socialism, certainly, He is generating this immense interest by talking about income inequality and all of the problems that exist in society. And that's something that we saw in Britain as well, happening really was happening simultaneously. Corbyn is coming out into the streets. Corbyn is, having these huge crowds of people come out, people who have never been interested in politics or have been completely turned away from it, people who used to be members of the Labour Party, let's say in the 1980s before they moved further to the right, or the 1990s when the Blairites took over. And what we saw is actually that the Blairite candidate, in other words, the one close enough to the views that Tony Blair would espouse or go for or promote, Liz Kendall, she received the least votes of anybody. She received something like 4 or 5% of the total votes in the election. And Corbyn ended up coming out on top with well over 60% of the votes. And what we saw was a great, as he called it, a great democratic exercise, because it was the first time, and I think some in the Labour leadership were perhaps a bit upset that they had chosen to do it this way. They said this is going to be an open election. If you're a Labour member, you can vote, and also if you're a supporter, you can pay £3, which is about $5, and you can also vote. You can just become a supporter temporarily. So over 250,000 people voted for Jeremy Corbyn, which is a huge number in Britain. A candidate who now suddenly goes from being in Parliament, a backbencher as they call it, because he never really got any attention, except when they needed a soundbite on war inequality from a radical who happened to be around, to being at the very front and sitting right across from David Cameron and challenging him on everything. And it's not just the British media that's vehemently attacked Corbyn, it's also people within his own party. Like, we can't get it twisted. The Labour Party, those who have been entrenched within the establishment, are plotting a coup against him. And they've made that very clear. So the question is really now, can Labour be transformed into a party to represent the working class? And there's a lot of debate on this. There's a conference of a group called Left Unity this weekend, which was supposed to be the British version of Syriza. And they're meeting to discuss should they dissolve the party and just join Labour. And there's a chance that could happen. We don't know for sure. So these are big questions in terms of tactics and organization. And Corbyn, for his part, has said that there has to be very strong extra-parliamentary struggle in the streets. We need to build citizens' assemblies, and we need to build the movement outside of the Labour Party that 60,000 people joined right after he won this leadership contest, by the way, which is more than the total membership of the third largest party in the country, the Liberal Democrats. So it gives you some indication of how this moved people into action. I know people who gave up on politics a long time ago in Britain from the left, but suddenly they've been reignited and they're back in the political scene because of this. So there's a lot of questions there in terms of how things are going to move forward. In the limited amount of time I have, because I think I have 3 or 4 minutes, I just want to go over the situation in Portugal briefly, because you had, in the recent election, parties from either the center-left or the left wing win slightly over 50% of the vote. Combined, the Socialist Party, which is sort of misnamed, the Communist Party and the Left Bloc, which is similar to a Syriza kind of organization, won 51% of the vote. Now, the Socialist Party, which is really a social democratic party, which would be more similar now to, in some ways, the Democratic Party, in terms of its neoliberal program that it's been espousing, suddenly they make a shift to the left, and they say that rather than partnering with the center-right political force, we'd like to form an anti-austerity triple-left government. Now, I would say that that's something that we would not have seen a year ago. We wouldn't have seen it because Syriza hadn't taken power yet. The Jeremy Corbyn phenomenon had not yet occurred. The situation in Spain, where Podemos became a serious political force to be reckoned with, had not yet happened. And Spain and Portugal, of course, share the Iberian Peninsula. But I think because of that, the Socialist Party that had been willing to go along with austerity and neoliberal programs and, essentially abandoning a lot of the social welfare state, there were elements within the party that looked at the situation, they said, now is the time that we can actually be part of an anti-austerity coalition and tap into that discontent, which is turning people actually largely away, even though, you know, they may come out and vote, but the voting numbers are much lower, and the interest in political parties that don't really adhere to much of actually changing things despite a name like the Socialist Party is minimal. So with Portugal, I think that's really unprecedented. I think the fact that the Communist Party of Portugal was able to come to this agreement shows some of the tactical flexibility that we did not see in Greece with the relationship between Syriza and the KKE. And I think there's the potential to definitely beat back the far right, both in parliament and in the streets, but these questions will continue to come up on how we do that and how we go about it. And for our part here in the United States, of course, we have the Vote 2016 presidential campaign of Gloria La Riva and Eugene Perrier. And that's important that we get out there with that message, because if Bernie Sanders is generating so much interest in what he calls democratic socialism, then we need to be there to say, well, this is what socialism is actually all about. So, exciting developments.